Good afternoon, good morning. No, I haven't shared on there. So it's great to see all of you. Well, and thank you for joining. So we all look forward to seeing you in person next month. I hope as many of you as possible can come. We're going to be talking about something really, really important in the region, which I'm sure you are dealing with every day in your work. And that's about how to create jobs for millions of Africans. So you don't want to miss this one. So take note of it and plan accordingly. So we are going to spend this morning basically just to go over some really, really important issues, which have actually a bearing for what we should be discussing next month in the forum. And that's really about what's happening to growth in Africa and whether the continent needs a new growth model that will be particularly useful for both reducing poverty and creating more jobs and better jobs. And so what we're going to do in this pulse are three key messages, just as an introduction. The first message is that we are beginning to see a rebound in economic activity in Africa that we haven't seen in the last 3 years prior. Okay, and we will tell you why and what's driving that recovery. The second message is that this recovery is really fragile. And we will then talk a little bit about the reasons why we think that the recovery is fragile. And some of you might be able to recognize this in your own countries. And then the fourth thing we're going to do is to say that this recovery is not going to be a sustainable one, neither is it going to be a major source of reducing poverty or creating jobs. And we will highlight one particular reason why that is the case, and that is the inequality in Africa. And we will explain why. Okay? So that's basically the lay of the land. That's how we will proceed. So let me start off by talking about the positive story. So as you can see in this graph, if you look at 2024, you will see that growth is projected to be about 3.4%. And that is a recovery from what it was last year, which was about 2.6%. And the main driver, this is why we think there's a rebound on the positive side. The main driver of that recovery from a bottoming out of 2.6% in 2023 to a 3.4% this year and projected to be 3.8% next year is basically a recovery in private consumption. You can see the green box there, right, in 2020 for 2024. So out of the 3.4% growth, 1.5% or almost half of it is driven by recovery of private consumption. Okay. And that's basically just households. Why is that? This is part of the reason why private consumption has recovered. Inflation has declined. You can see, for example, that last year the median inflation was estimated at 7.1. It's down to 5. It's projected to remain there for a while. And you can also see that the number of countries that now have inflation that is less than 5%, has gone up to almost 23 countries, as many as what it was a couple of years ago. So there is a declining inflation, which is, as we know, allows families to begin to have a little bit of discretionary spending. The budgets are less squeezed. And so, they are able to buy more and consume more. And that's part of the reason. Now, there are three other reasons. I mean, there are two other things that would usually drive recovery and on the consumption side. That's government's consumption and, of course, investments and net exports. Now, you can see here, and so you can see here, so government consumption is kind of constrained, and that is because a lot of countries cannot spend much, because they're doing a lot of fiscal consolidation. We'll talk a little bit about that. And investments, even though they are the second largest contributors, have been constrained because of high interest rates that are prevailing across the world, but particularly domestically in a lot of countries in Africa. And exports haven't really recovered much, as you can see, relative to imports. So that's one reason. The other reason is that here's just another explanation for why inflation has actually come down. So the two major drivers of inflation in recent years have been food inflation, precisely because of what's going on in faraway lands like Ukraine, that led to massive spike in both food and fuel inflation. But you can see food inflation also has domestic constraints because of climate change and all kinds of reasons. But you can see that only a few countries now are dealing with double-digit inflations in food. The other driver has been domestic currencies that have been declining, and you can.
Someone is saying the slides are not showing on the screen. Are you able to see the slides?
Can you see the slides?
Yes, the graphs, yes.
Okay, so then the interpreter.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, good. Good. I'm glad. So just on inflation, there've been in recent years there've been two major drivers of inflation. One is the food inflation, and you can see that a lot of countries now have, if you see the green diamonds, that's the 2020. I mean, that is the food inflation, and then the headline inflation are the orange. Is it pink or orange? Pink. Bars, and you can see that for a lot of countries now, there is an alignment between food and overall inflation, except for a dozen or so countries, which are still battling a lot of, very high levels of inflation. And then on the right-hand side, you see the exchange rate, which have also been major drivers of inflation in recent months or the last year or so. And that's because a lot of these currencies have been declining or have been depreciating relative to the US dollar. And because they are weakening, import costs have really skyrocketed for African countries, especially imports of again, food and fuel and other things like pharmaceuticals and so on. And, Sifiso, can you see the slides?
We can see part of the right-hand side. The exchange
You
rate.
can see
Yes, I can see the slide. Sorry.
Who said they cannot see the right-hand side?
We can see part of the slide on the exchange rate.
Okay. Let's reshare.
The other part is covered by the photos of the participants.
So then we need to move this the screen. You need to move the screen on your side.
And show gallery.
Or close the participant screen.
View. How do you see your view?
Have you done that?
If you go on the view, choose standard. So in the Zoom, top right-hand side, you see view and choose standard. That way you see the slides full.
That's where I am. I'm at standard.
Okay.
But you can go ahead. It's not serious. I
Okay,
can see most of the countries.
Okay.
all
I
right.
was
So
worried because I didn't see my country. That's why I was worried.
can you see a country now?
Not yet. Not on the right.
Okay, push the participants down or to the top, and you will be able to see. Okay, so the other reason why there is some optimism in terms of global recovery is because there is some resilience that have been noted in the global economy, right? So there was a lot of concern that the prevailing high levels of interest rates because of high levels of inflation in rich countries will actually lead to recessions. And that whatever was going on in China, which is a major growth pole in the world, was also going to actually drag down growth for the rest of the world. And these are major trading partners for African commodities, right? Because that's what Africa trades on most, especially China and the US and Europe. So the fear was that these regions were going to go into recession this year, but that actually has not happened. As you can see from the graph on the left, just from a typical index that people monitor about economic activity and the buoyancy of economic work. Economic activity in the world. There was actually an uptick towards the end of 2023, and into 2024. From a bottoming out around October, it started recovering again. And that's partly because of what's going on in inflation, where core inflation has actually been declining over several months since 2002, right? So that's another reason why there is optimism about the forecast for growth in Africa. And then fiscal balances are also recovering, right? As you can see here, these are basically, as a result of what the governments are doing in terms of mobilizing more resources, but also trying to rationalize their spending, they're beginning to actually reduce the deficits, and that eventually will free up more resources for investments and long-term growth, right? So those are some of the reasons why we think the recovery is actually underway or positive. But I don't want people to think that this means basically that we're out of the crisis, right? That's by no means what this is about. What this is saying is that we hope that there are that this is going to be, 2023 was going to be the bottom, and that we're going to have a slow but maybe durable recovery. But then, we want to talk about how to actually, jumpstart growth even more strongly than what we've seen so far. But the fragilities are there, and so let's talk about the fragilities, right? So one reason why the recovery is very fragile is just because debt service, these countries are, being dragged down by huge levels of debt. And the cost of debt servicing is really, really high. Okay, so I said earlier that, government spending and government investments are subdued because of fiscal consolidation. Well, this is one reason why government spending is actually subdued. It's the fact that on the left hand, you can see how much these countries on average are spending on debt service, right? That is 47% of revenues, right? Almost half of the revenues on average. Okay, some of course are spending a lot more and some much less. But on average, 47% of revenues in African countries were used for debt servicing, and this is this is really debilitating because that's money that you can't use to build all kinds of needed investments in roads, for energy provision, for building water and sanitation system, health, education, spending, you name it, right? So that's a lot of resources that is actually not being put to jumpstart durable and important investments. And you can see on the right-hand side that at the same time, gross financing needs are really, really large, right? Gross financing needs, just as a reminder, comprise two things. One is the gap between revenues and spending, right? So the deficits, which tells you how much resources you need to get in order to reduce that gap, and the obligations you have to pay your debt. So that's a debt servicing, right? So the combination of debt services plus the shortfall in revenue is how much financing you need in order to be able to meet your obligations, both in the domestic investment side, but also on the external obligations to pay off debt. And you can see that, only a decade ago, it was, only 2% of your GDP. That's all you really needed. Now it's up to like almost 11. Okay, that's fivefold in terms of the financing need. So this is why it's really difficult to think about this growth as something that is going to be sustainable as long as this situation prevails. Okay, so the second reason is because alternatives to government spending all have really basically slowed down substantially, right? So alternative sources of financing have dried up. So if you look at, so what are those alternatives? One is, as we talked a little bit, as we mentioned, is FDI, say foreign direct investment or investments in general, right? But in particular, let's focus on foreign direct investments. This will be, specific types of finances that will come to provide certain services, say maybe building a dam, maybe building a power plant, maybe setting a university or whatever. These are things that will not add up to debt for a country, but will provide really badly needed services from the private sector. And you can see that has been declining. So that's the orange line. So that has been declining over time. And there's nothing that suggests that it is turning the corner. The second source of financing in recent years have been China, and that's the red line, right? And you can see that also has been declining, and it's slowed down substantially. I think the numbers have been, the numbers I've seen are that maybe China has committed about $1 billion so far in foreign investments in Africa, while it used to be in double-digit billions. So from 2016, it was about 1% of the GDP in Africa, and that's 1% of, I don't know, how much is the GDP in Sub-Saharan Africa? 2 point something trillion,
yeah,
right? So 1% of 2 point something trillion is hundreds or several billions. But that's down to less than 0.5%, right? So that has substantial decline. The third source of funding in recent years has been financial markets, right? And those financial markets, national bond issuances, have completely collapsed. The countries have been completely shut out of that. And the ones that have been lucky enough to go back and actually get something, there have been 3 so far. That's Benin, Cote d'Ivoire, and Kenya. They're paying very high premiums, right? And it's extremely costly, right? And so that is also not something sustainable. And let's put it this way: for many countries in Africa that are not, either Cote d'Ivoire or Kenya or Benin, the premiums that are being quoted are in double digits, 12% or something like that. So that's it's really expensive as a form of debt. And then the fourth one is, of course, the money that goes to Africa through multilateral development banks like the World Bank, IMF, African Development Bank, and so on, and bilaterals. And that one is the blue line, and that, after peaking around 2020 because of the pandemic, has come down to its historical average. So at the same time that these alternative sources are drying up or declining, we're not seeing a sustained increase in ODA necessarily. In fact, we see that it is coming down to the average. It's basically remaining constant and unchanging. All right. So that's a significant source of concern for these countries. And then, of course, this is something we're all very familiar. The region is experiencing a really heightened and elevated levels of conflict and violence across the board, whether it is in West Africa, Eastern Africa, the Horn, where the Central, you name it, right? There's no region that is spared, and then on top of that you have shocks like climate, which we haven't even captured here, which disrupts production. It creates a lot of uncertainty. It causes a lot of displacement and a lot of suffering, of course. So that also affects investments and growth in general. So that's the near-term outlook for the region, right? But I think we need to put this into context, right? In the context of a much longer history for the region. And that longer history is one in which Africa has typically been a region of low growth. I've said this in the past, and I think it's worth repeating. So if you look at this graph on the left, this is the most recent period, the last decade or so, since 2015, where you see per capita growth in sub-Saharan Africa. All right, so if you just take, just ignore 2020, and you look at the rest of the decade, right? You can see that on average, per capita growth has been lingering around between 0 and 1%. Okay, that's substantially lower than what the region experienced a decade prior to that. So the decade prior to that, the average growth per capita, and you can see that there's that little green line, and the average growth per capita in between 2000 and 2014 was 2.4%. So that was one of the best decade in Africa. That is still not high enough if you really think about it, compared to, say, what other regions in the world that have reduced poverty substantially have grown at. It's in the order of 6-7% per capita, something close to twice or three times what we've experienced in the best years. And in addition, on the right-hand side, we show that even when recoveries happen, so for example, now, let's say we start having a major recovery now in 2024 and for the next several years. Usually those recoveries in Africa don't last more than 3 years before we go into another downturn, right? Compared to, say, places like East Asia or South Asia, where recoveries actually last much longer, 8 years, 6 years, and so on, right? So growth is not only low, it's not really sustained, right? And it has been very costly. That kind of growth has been extremely costly. It's costly in two ways. One way is the graph on the left. If African countries were able to sustain the growth, the per capita growth that they sustained between 2000 and 2014, right? The 2.4% per capita growth. If they were to sustain that through 2024, the incomes of African families will be 35% higher than what it is now. Okay? So you can see that on the left, that green line straight up suggests that, the growth per capita, per capita income would be 35% higher. So that's something that have been lost because of this low growth that have prevailed in the last 1 decade. The second way in which this has been costly is just that the continent gets left behind. And you can see on the right-hand side that this is the relative GDP per capita for sub-Saharan Africa relative to the rest of the world in the last, 40 years or so. Okay? And you can see that it has been either flat or declining, while other regions like South Asia or East Asia have really caught up with the rest of the world. Right? So this is the many ways in which this has been extremely costly. Now, and because that it has been, so the other way in which, of course, this is costly is just that, poverty levels remain extremely high, and you can see that on the left-hand side. Sub-Saharan Africa, about 1/3 of the population remains extremely poor, and that is because African growth, not only is it low and not sustainable, but in addition, it is very inefficient in terms of reducing poverty, right? So you can see that, in fact, for an increase in African growth, right? An increase in African growth is basically, it's almost as if it is going at half speed, right? In terms of reducing poverty. The rest of the world, for the same level of growth, 1% growth in increase in growth, will get poverty reduction at 2.2%. In Africa, it's half of that. Okay, so growth is low, it's not sustained, and it is not able to actually transmute into poverty reduction nearly as fast as the rest of the world, right? And as a result of that, we have what we see now on the left, which is high levels of poverty. And we haven't talked about jobs yet. Okay, so that's the historical backdrop. The question is this: so why is this growth so low? So there are so many reasons. I mean, I'm sure you have your theories. You've read a lot of books that have proposed all kinds of hypotheses, and there are many, and they're all reasonably valid. You've had the region is not well connected, so infrastructure, both the density and the quality of infrastructure is poor, whether that is power, whether that is roads, the railway networks, and so on. They don't trade nearly as much, and the cost of trade is really high. There are lots of shocks, such as we've discussed, climate, conflict, and so on, poor sources of governance, and so on. But one of the things that is not typically talked a lot about, and which is what we want to provide a spotlight on here, is actually inequality. Africa is known for high levels of poverty. Not too many people actually are aware that Africa is also a really high inequality region. It's second most unequal region, second only to Latin America. And you can see this graph here in terms of just the Gini index of 42 compared to 47%, right? So the question is, what are these inequalities, right? So, and what we are going to make a case for in the report, and I hope you've either read the report or are going to read, is that these levels of inequality are tightly linked to what we observe about low growth and also low transmission of growth to poverty reduction. Okay, that's the hypothesis we're going to propose. We're basically to advance in this report. And the main argument we're making here is that these inequalities are structural, by which we mean that these are inequalities that are not due to people's effort or people's ability, but are really due to things that people do not have control of. Okay? So let's start with children, right? A child doesn't have control of where they are born or to whom they are born. Okay? But if you look at outcomes for children in Africa, okay, So say, for example, completion of primary education, or how much immunization a child gets, or how much nutrition they get, right? Whether they're malnourished or not. If you just look at those kinds of outcomes, which are really important for human capital formation, 70% of the differences in those outcomes, in terms of just access to public services, in education, in health, in nutrition, and so on, 70% of this are accounted for by just two factors: location, where a child is born, whether it's urban or not, whether it's one region or the other, lagging region or not, and to whom they are born. Basically, the education or of her mother or father, right? Just those two explains nearly all these differences in children's outcomes. And so when you then look at, for example, you compare children to their family, to their parents, right? You take a cohort of children who were born in the 1980s, and you compare them to their parents in terms of educational attainment. We find that only less than 40% of children in Africa have more education than their parents. Okay, any level of education. And so that suggests that, in fact, there isn't a lot of intergenerational mobility. Like people, there's not a whole lot of opportunities to be better than your parents for the children who are coming, who are born to these parents, right? So they're, in a way, they're stuck. And if you're stuck in these levels of poverty, you can see why it's very difficult to actually, for families to get out of poverty, right? There's not a lot of mobility. And so when you see that the elasticity of growth to poverty reduction that we saw here, when you see this elasticity being low, 1.1%, part of the reason is because of this. There is not a whole lot of intergenerational mobility. There's a whole lot of cohorts, young people who cannot get out of poverty because they don't have those opportunities to get out of poverty, right? So that's one way in which inequality is actually really bad for growth and for poverty reduction. Another way is because of the structural inequalities also manifesting themselves when people are adults. There are all kinds of market obstacles. When they're participating in markets, there are all kinds of obstacles, whether it is land markets, which they can't get access to land, whether it is credit markets. If you have a business idea and you're a great entrepreneur, well, you may not be able to get credit. And so you can't really build a viable and prosperous company, right? Labor markets, all kinds of discrimination, by gender, by ethnicity, all kinds of things. So when you look at these distortions in the markets, again, these are things people don't have any control of, right? Whether you're born a man or a woman, you don't have control over that. Whether you're born to a particular ethnic group, you don't have control over it. So when you're denied these connections, what happens is that business formation is stalled, talent is misallocated, and so what you get is that you stymie growth. And you can see here, for example, an example of the types of businesses that prevail in Africa compared to, say, a country like the United States, right? So it's not only like the input markets and all kinds of markets, but also product markets are heavily regulated. They are, really distorted, and they prevent allocation of talent. Okay, so that's another structural form of inequality that creates these problems in growth. And then you can think that, okay, maybe the government then can undo a lot of this, right? And in fact, they do, right? On the left-hand side, you see that, in fact, when you look at, just look at the African countries, right? High income, upper middle income. So HIC is high income African countries, and UMIC is upper middle income countries. L is low middle income countries. LIC is low income countries, right? So if you look at those, the blue dots is level of inequality at the time that these adults actually come to the market. So the market income that they get without any interventions, right, will give you levels of inequality that are much higher than when the government actually begins to intervene, which is the yellow, right? So the yellow dot is after the transfers have taken place, right? It's the consumable income, meaning it's the market income plus all the transfers and taxes that you take, right? So in fact, African countries do reduce inequality quite substantially by what they do in terms of transfers and redistribution of some sort. It's just that the levels of inequality are so high that even after the government action, inequalities remain pretty high, right? So that's what that picture tells you. While if you compare to non-African countries, right, the far right, the far left kind of set of graphs, right, they start off with much lower levels of inequality in the first place. And so when the governments actually intervene, the inequalities come even lower. But they don't, the level of if the effectiveness is not nearly as high, it's just that in African countries, inequalities start off really, really high, right? But that's not the same thing on the poverty side, unfortunately, right? On the poverty side, and that's the right-hand side, once you account for taxes, transfers, and subsidies, a lot of African poor end up paying more into paying more in taxes than they get in terms of transfers and subsidies. And so poverty levels actually go up. That's what that graph on the right suggests, right? So in principle, the African fiscal policies actually do reduce inequality a little bit, but on the other hand, they actually increase poverty on the after you account for all the subsidies and taxes and transfers, right? So this is to suggest that the fiscal policy have a role, but it is not going to be enough. Okay, that's the main point here. The main point here is that in order to be able to actually change the dynamics of poverty reduction and growth in Africa, we're going to have to remove the distortions here and here, okay? Because fiscal policy is just not going to be enough. These countries are not rich enough to just use fiscal policy to remedy all kinds of disadvantages that exist, okay? So coming to this is the last slide. How much time have I spoken?
20 minutes.
Okay. Sorry about that, but this is the last slide. Basically, the idea is, we need to actually restore macroeconomic stability. That's essential. It cannot be, you can't do without it. And that means basically a lot of issues around, debt management, debt restructuring, building capacity for, fiscal management and discipline. The second thing is, of course, really thinking very hard about promoting intergenerational mobility so that people have opportunities to move up the income ladder. But that can only happen if you really think about removing distortions in markets, whether those are land, labor, capital, credit markets. And then finally, it's really important to have a fiscal policy that is progressive and really does not punish the poor. So that's basically the recommendations here. So let me stop here. Sorry, I've spoken for too long.
Thank you, Andrew. So I guess now we open the floor. So if questions, comments, contributions, I think it's a very detailed presentation. I'm not sure if it's optimism or pessimism, or where do we stand? But you guys are the main men on the ground, and so it'll be good to hear feedback from you as to how far this resonates with what you are seeing in your various countries, and maybe what are some of the things that could be done to address the issues.